Hello everyone and welcome back to another installment from our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. COVID has been a challenging and unexpected time. The uncertainty gave NZIA the chance to measure the emissions from different event delivery models, in person, online and hybrid. Their online events program in 2021 produced more emissions than that of its hybrid counterpart in 2020. Smaller events in multiple regions, contrary to what might have been expected. This is due to things like data center emissions. These are out of sight for the most part, so out of mind. Here's a sneak preview.
I would reiterate that it is a journey that you need to be on, and you need to be invested in it for the long term. So it's not something that you can do 1 year and leave and forget. It is one of those things that you are going to need to be committed to and continuously looking for. As a consequence of the data collection is the time that you need to invest. And that time is not only about data collection, but it's the time to invest in understanding the methodology. It is a balancing act. There is no perfect answer in terms of the response, and there is no quick, immediate win in the case of some of the decisions that we're needing to make.
So we use the Aotearoa database. It accounts for international trade between countries, and it gives you a kilograms of CO2 equivalent value per dollar of spend in a given category. The Institute's direct emissions are basically negligible. So the Institute actually has no Scope 1 emissions. There's no direct emissions from the Institute's operations.
There are various key takeaways from this webinar with NZIA that may help you manage and ultimately reduce your carbon footprint. The main being that communication is essential, focus on scopes that are relevant to you, finding the right balance, and finally, you can't manage what you don't measure. With that, let's get started.
So kia ora koutou. Welcome along, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the webinar, Finding Balance. And hopefully balance is what we find. I guess it sounds a little bit like the title of a yoga retreat or a meditation retreat. So we're going to be trying to do a little bit of that, but with carbon footprinting. This webinar is part of our regular series, Straight from the Horse's Mouth, Insights from Experts in 30 Minutes. And I'm pleased to welcome our expert for today, which is Teena Hale Pennington, the Chief Executive of Kāhui, Whaihanga, the New Zealand Institute of Architects. So welcome along, Teena. Been working together for the past, I guess, almost a year, or how long has it been, on carbon footprinting of the organisation of the Institute. And yeah, I'd like to hand over the floor to Teena to talk you through some of what they've been up to.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation to be part of this today. It's a wonderful opportunity to share what we've been doing, and hopefully there are a couple of lessons or takeaways that people might find interesting. So Te Kāhui Whaihanga, the New Zealand Institute of Architects, was established in 1905. So we have a rich history in supporting the profession of architects, but also the practice of architecture. As part of our history and heritage, we're also committed to a Te Kawanata Orata, which is a covenant or partnership relation with the Māori Designers Network, which we're incredibly proud of in terms of that work. We have 4,500 odd members across the country, ranging from students, academics, graduates, architects, retired members. And we're looking at the wellbeing of New Zealand through architecture and the influence that it can play across communities, the economy, the environment, culture. You can see the work and influence of architects in everyday life, whether it be schools, hospitals, libraries, public toilets, housing, and the impact is essential and meaningful to people across the community. We support our members through a range of things, events, activities, resources, etc. And we have a large education and events program. Our carbon footprint work came about because of a member motion at our 2021 annual general meeting. And I want to thank that member for that motion and sparing this work and initiating this work and this conversation amongst the Institute, our board and our members. If I reflect on the work that we've done with thinkstep-anz, I'd note a couple of observations in terms of things that we've observed. So one of the things is working with a trusted advisor, and I think that can't be underestimated in terms of being essential, providing for confidence, the expertise, the balance, understanding the methodology. And I would like to thank Jeff and Dom for the fantastic work that they've done in relationship to that trusted advisor role with us. There's no denying the work is data intensive. That's part of the work of actually understanding what your footprint is. And I wouldn't underestimate that data analysis inquiry. And while you might have that information sitting within your organisation, sometimes it's the accumulation, agglomeration, mixing of that information that you need to put together to answer some of the methodology questions. Time, I suppose a consequence of the data collection is the time that you need to invest. And that time is not only about data collection, but it's the time to invest in understanding the methodology and making sure that you understand how that methodology applies to your business or to, in our case, the Institute and our core activities and how we operate. So I think, don't underestimate the time that's taken. Be prepared to ask questions. And I know Jeff and Dom were inundated with some questions from both the management team or the national office of the Institute, but also our board in terms of understanding what the methodology meant, what it meant to the business that we run in terms of our members, how it applies to some of the assumptions and background, and what you actually count and include and exclude. So those questions are all important. And as I said, the methodology is important. We made a deliberate decision in terms of the work that we did to separate out the methodology and understanding the methodology from the results. And we did that at both across the levels of the national office team, management team, the board and our members. And it was really important that everyone understood what methodology we're doing and how that was assembled so that when we looked at the results, we had a clear understanding of what those things were. So we did share the results, and those results were shared across those variety of audiences, and we could talk quite confidently about what the results were in the context of the methodology. I suppose we're at the point now about engaging in those choices, and I suppose today's title around finding balance is all about how do you navigate the choices that you make in terms of decarbonisation? Where do you get the greatest value in terms of the changes that you're making? So one of the things we had the opportunity to explore as primarily an events-based activity, is that we could look at our profile of events. So the slide on the left-hand side shows that unlike running a hypothetical scenario, we were able to actually use real data of changes that we made due to the disruptions that we've all experienced over the last 2 years in terms of the events that we run in the Institute. So the 2019 year is essentially a full program of activities in person. Our 2020 year reflected a change or a hybrid model where we had in-person, virtual, and a combination of those things. And our 2021 year profiled some significant online event activities. So we were able to explore all the different combinations with real information as opposed to hypothetically thinking through what those consequences might be. And I would be fair to say that I think some of the results surprised us in terms of how those things played out in the methodology. And the right-hand slide shows a breakdown of our activities. And I didn't want to explore that in any great detail other than to say, if you look at the lighter green colour, which is at the bottom of the 3 bars, this shows our New Zealand Awards event run as 3 different formats. So 2019, we did it fully in person. 2020 ran it as a hybrid option, and that hybrid option was across four locations across New Zealand, where we had a primary location and then we beamed and had satellite events in 3 other locations across New Zealand. And our 2021 was a full online version. So you can still see that full online environment still has an impact in terms of the methodology, in terms of scope 3 and purchase goods and services. So there is no escaping the carbon question, and our events format, regardless of how we deliver it, does have an impact in terms of carbon. So you can see that in the graph there. One of the important things that we've done in response to the work is to start asking our members for feedback in terms of where their value is, what their understanding is, what are they doing in the practice and their own practice around carbon. So this just gives you a few insights into some of our members in the profile in terms of what they think in terms of climate change personally. And the next slide talks about what they think in terms of professionally. And then if we look at what work they've been doing in their own practice in response to being prepared. So you can see that, there are some people who are feeling very confident about being prepared, and there are others that are unsure and thinking that they need to do a little bit more work. And if we look at whether they've actually done footprinting work, we've got a majority that haven't done that work yet and a small minority that have. And then if we look at when they've done that, we've seen a significant amount of people invest in that work in the last 12 months. So it gives us a sense of people understanding where people are on the journey. And I would reiterate that it is a journey that you need to be on, and you need to be invested in it for the long term. So it's not something that you can do 1 year and leave and forget. It is one of those things that you are going to need to be committed to and continuously looking for. We were looking in terms of support for the Institute making change in terms of decarbonisation over the next 3 to 4 years, and you can see some strong feedback from members about what that looks like in terms of that. And if we move on in terms of the next slide, what we're up to from here is the decarbonisation plan. So what do we do in response to that footprint and that baseline? So at the moment, we're looking at things that we can do in that space and what that means for our events program. We're also trying to better understand where member value in our events program looks like. So given that we are predominantly an event-based organisation, we're looking at what that combination of things might be in the future. And I'm sure Jeff will touch on this. One of the other things, I suppose, through our education is the impact of the architect's handprint. So it's about how do we ensure that as a profession we can make meaningful and significant contributions to New Zealand's built environment, but also the outcomes in terms of carbon, in terms of the profession. So we've been looking quite carefully at what we can do around our professional development programs, education, support and resources to ensure that the profession is prepared for some of the major changes that are coming in terms of building for climate change. So the next slide just touches on my final thoughts, and some of these things I've touched on earlier, but I think it's worth reminding, is that the baseline year was a very conscious decision from us in terms of being 2019. It was a deliberate decision to understand the full extent of everything that we did in a time that wasn't part of significant disruption. So it gave us a clear picture of who we were, what we were doing, and how we were going about it. So that was an important decision, which had a strong rationale of why choose it. So I would encourage you to think about that baseline year in the context of how you actually undertake the footprint work. Data and options. Data is always improving, and I know that we are, as a consequence of this work, looking at how we assemble our information, what information we might ask from suppliers, how we might format our information, the time of which we collect it, the format in which we collect it. They are all of the things that we're doing as a consequence. It wasn't as though we didn't have the information. There's just a structure that would improve in terms of responding to the methodology. It is a balancing act. There is no perfect answer in terms of the response, and there is no quick, immediate win in the case of some of the decisions that we're needing to make. And it is a balance between how do you engender a sense of community in a professional body, in a member-based organisation, and how do you generate that value for members who are looking for a variety of things throughout their career. So if they're a student, they're looking for a particular outcome, vis-a-vis a registered architect who's looking for some different outcomes. So how do we provide a full suite of value across those member types? And engagement and communications, absolutely paramount. I wouldn't underestimate the time that's needed, particularly around the methodology. Methodology is not easy if it's not your day job and it's not part of what you're thinking. But it is important that people understand the context of what they're going to be presented with. So that methodology is important, but equally the explanation of the results back to the methodology and that linkage and relationship. So I wouldn't underestimate those things. All in all, I would encourage everyone to take the courageous move to understand their baseline so that you can make some decision choices that balance moving forward. So thank you.
All right, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to build a little bit on what Teena said and go through a little bit more of the detail and just unpack that a little bit. So working through the methodology, how we approach this, and then what the results were, and then ultimately what that means, picking up on the handprint concept that Teena flagged through her presentation. And so if we look at like carbon footprinting for an organization, there's a sort of typical process that we might follow. And the diagram you can see on the right is just talking about the different scopes of emissions, your scope 1 being your direct emissions, scope 2 being your electricity that you're purchasing in, and scope 3 being basically everything else, all the upstream and downstream activities in your value chain. So we need to define what the boundary of the organization is, what's in and what's out. And that's interesting for an organization that's supporting lots of other organizations. A lot of the work that we do as a business is supporting product manufacturers or large corporates or whatever. And it's really interesting to then go and work with an association that's supporting its members and doing quite different things and quite different activities. So it's drawing a box around that and what we're including and what we aren't. The next part is, once you've drawn your box, what are the items inside that of all these different categories that we can see here? That what are the ones that are going to be important to the results, and which are the ones that we can exclude as being either immaterial or not relevant? Then we need to go through the process of collecting the activity data, so the actual stuff that we can use, whether it's dollars spent on something or it's liters of fuel burnt or whatever it is, or kilometers of air travel or whatever it happens to be, getting that kind of information so we can actually start to do something. And then to do something, we need to have some emission factors. So where do we find those? We then need to calculate what the emissions are, and then we actually need to do something useful with all of that. And so I'm going to talk through some of this. I'm going to give the least focus to the activity data because it's quite specific to the Institute and how it structures its information, and every organisation has its own unique set of challenges and things it needs to work through with that. In terms of the boundary, we use what's called an operational control boundary as opposed to equity share or financial control, which just means that everything under the operational control of the Institute was in scope. As Teena mentioned, we had a lot of discussion about which reference year to use, and we focused on 2019, but we did include some adjustments to reflect changes in the Institute up until 2021, keeping in mind that things don't stay still. And we used what's called a materiality threshold of 1%, which means that a category needs to contribute 1% or more of the emissions to be in scope. We did include some things that were beneath that though. When you're thinking about materiality assessment, you're looking across the different scopes of emissions. So scope 1 is your direct emissions, scope 2 is your purchased energy, typically electricity, and then you've got all your other scope 3 categories, which is basically everything else, the stuff that you're buying, the upstream emissions of the energy use, upstream transportation, your waste, business travel, getting the employees to and from the business, all of that stuff, that's all falls into your scope 3 category, or the scope 3 scope, I should probably say. And when we look in the case of the Institute, what we found is it was really 4 of these scope 3 categories that were most relevant. So it was purchase goods and services, because as Teena mentioned, the Institute runs lots of events, and those events don't just host themselves. They have to, have venue hire. There has to be purchased, everyone likes a drink and something to eat at a conference, otherwise they might not show up again. And so there's all of the impacts associated with that stuff. Then there's the impacts associated with getting people, both the Institute staff, but actually more importantly, all of the keynote speakers to those events, which was particularly important in the pre-COVID world, where some of those people weren't from New Zealand. So a lot of them would be international keynotes flown from wherever it happens to be in the world to New Zealand, often over a very long distance. And so that has an impact. There's also employee commuting. You have to get the Institute staff to and from its office. And there's, the fact that the Institute leases premises. But some of these things aren't, not everything's created equal, and some of these didn't have particularly much impact, whereas others had a lot. In terms of the activity data stuff, I said I wouldn't cover this in a lot of detail, but, we're looking at the purchased electricity, we're looking at the financial accounts, we're looking at travel reports, and we're looking at how staff get to and from work, basically. So those are the key things that we needed to understand. From there, we needed to identify different types of emission factors, and there's different types that you can use. So there's activity-based emission factors, which are generally considered to be more accurate. So that might be kilometers of travel in a car, or in the case of the Institute, often renting or hiring out vehicles, whether it's a bus or a chartered plane or whatever it is to get to wherever they need to be. There's some, there is a certain number of kilometers of travel in a certain vehicle type. Then for where you don't have that kind of true activity data that's based on like physical quantities, then we end up with spend-based data for other things. So the amount of money you spend on IT services, or in the case of the virtual conferences, all of the stuff associated with pre-recording stuff, getting IT set up, there's a lot of, other things that goes on to make that happen. And all of that has an emission. It's kind of a largely hidden emission. It's not as obvious as flying in a plane or driving a car, but there's nevertheless emissions associated with all that stuff. And that can be captured by a spend-based factor. And so this is a kind of common approach being used around the world, where you can use the activity-based data, but you also recognize that, hey, there's lots of stuff that's service-driven. It's other things that we just don't have good activity data for yet. And we don't, so we just have to use these generic country-level spend factors. And so for the activity-based data, we used the Ministry for the Environment's guide, measuring emissions, and that was used to apply for business travel, for employee commuting, for purchased electricity, and for waste to landfill, keeping in mind that some of these things for the Institute are pretty negligible. So purchased electricity and the small amount of waste they produce in their office is not really that significant compared to the large-scale events they're running, for example. It's worth noting there's been a new version of this released since we did the work. This is a 2022 guide now available. For the spend-based emission factors, we use something called Aotearoa, which is a global multi-regional input-output database. It is a commercial database, so you have to pay for it, something to be aware of. And we use that for things like venue hire, for IT and audio-visual expenses, for all other purchase services. So if you're using a law firm, an accountancy firm, whatever, all of that stuff needs to be captured. If the Institute needs to purchase services to develop, training materials for continuing professional development or anything like that, that money is spent to pay professionals to do work, and there's an emission associated with them at their desk doing the work, and it's that kind of thing that's captured. So we use the Aotearoa database. It accounts for international trade between countries, and it gives you a kilograms of CO2 equivalent value per dollar of spend in a given category. It's worth noting that we've also released a version of our own set of freely available factors, which can be used. We released it for consultation earlier this year. The full version's due out imminently. I've been saying that for a little while, and so for all those waiting for it, I apologise. It's already overdue. We've had a bit of illness in the team, and that's held things up a little bit, so I do apologise, but it will be coming out soon. There is the consultation version's been out since January. In terms of what we found, I think some of these things are probably not too surprising if you're in the space of carbon footprinting, in the sense that the Institute's direct emissions are basically negligible. So the Institute actually has no scope 1 emissions. There's no direct emissions from the Institute's operations. There's some negligible, very small emissions from purchased electricity to run the office kind of thing, but it's not particularly important. And so everything else, 99.9% of the emissions are in the scope 3 category. They're upstream and downstream of the Institute itself, and pretty much they're upstream. So they're purchases. If we look at where that stuff comes from, you can see these are the different categories that we had. You can see the dominant one is purchase goods and services. It's the stuff the Institute buys, and that's the stuff to run the events as well as the stuff to run the Institute itself. There's a significant impact from business travel. That's not just Teena flying around first class everywhere. It's actually mostly the emissions of getting speakers to and from events. And some of them are coming for a long distance, keeping in mind this is 2019, pre-COVID, and there were lots of international speakers. And so that has a significant footprint. The employee commuting makes up some impact, but it's quite small. And this C3 fuel and energy related is basically insignificant, as is the waste. Okay, so if we break that down a little bit further and look at where the emissions come from, so not so much which scope they're in, but what they're attributed to, I think that tells an interesting story. So there's the corporate part of the Institute, which is running itself, its staff, its office, the things that are required to make an organization tick. You need IT services, you need legal services, you need whatever you need. And then there's the actual conference and events, which is by far and away more than half of the total emissions. This is the year where the Institute runs a biannual conference. So every second year, 2019 was the year where it was run, and you can see a full third or more than a third of the emissions are from that conference. All of the other events collectively were a quarter or so of the total emissions. And so there's a little bit of more work that can be done to split this and make it more granular, but it gives you an idea of something like an institute that's running events on behalf of its members. That's a significant part of its total emissions profile. So I wanted to kind of come back to this idea of the balancing act. What are we trying to do here? And I guess the challenge that we've got is, when you use these numbers, we've all got our part to play in addressing climate change. We all need to decarbonize, and I think we all recognize that. But I think the challenge is that when you're running an institute that's supporting members and potentially could be supporting them to decarbonize a high impact thing, like a high carbon footprint thing like buildings, then I think there's a challenge there of how deep you want to cut. Because yeah, sure, you can reduce the institute's emissions. You can reduce them to zero by closing the institute down, but does that help anyone? If you cancel all the events, does that help? We saw from the previous example that, you can run them all online, and yeah, that's going to make a difference, but it's not going to take it to zero, and it's not even going to take it down. Maybe it's going to cut it in half, but maybe it cuts it by more than half, but it's still not, it's not the dramatic reductions that perhaps we think we need. And so I think there's a lesson here that, yes, you want to decarbonize. Yes, we all need to decarbonize, but we may not all need to decarbonize equally. And we have to just think about what's equitable in the case of decarbonization. And what I've put here is just a little seesaw. This is a diagram from the emissions reduction plan that the government released, showing the emissions of buildings to be about 15% of New Zealand's gross emissions. So you can see that here, 15% of Aotearoa's emissions on the right-hand side here, versus the Institute's emissions at 0.002%. Now, that doesn't include the emissions of all the other architectural practices. And if we include all of those together, it will be a high number, but it will be well less than 1%. And so we just need to consider the potential trade-off here. Architects have the ability to influence this number. To what extent should we reduce this number? And it's just a conversation to be had. And so in the context of this, when I was presenting these findings to the Institute, the thing I always kind of came back to was the idea of handprint versus footprint. So if your footprint is the negative impact that you have on society or the environment, your handprint is the potential to have a positive contribution. It's what you give back. And you give that back through the active restoration or through reducing the impact of something else. And the Institute, through its work, empowers architects to design buildings where people can live, work, and play. And by taking that mission and focusing on low carbon design and regenerative design, I personally think the Institute can have a handprint that's many, many, many times larger than its footprint. And I think that's just something worth keeping in mind. So when you're setting decarbonization targets and you're asking yourself, how deep should we cut? I think some organizations need to be more ambitious than others. And I just wanted to make that point. And so that's all of my slides. And I guess what I wanted to do now was to open to your questions and to take any questions for Teena. Okay, so maybe one question from me. You mentioned some of the findings were surprising, Teena. What was the most surprising thing that you can remember?
I think it's probably the earlier comment, Jeff, that I made around the full virtual delivery of events and how it was not insignificant in terms of the methodology. I mean, I expected that it would be very low in terms of relative to sort of the hybrid model, and it wasn't. And that did take me by surprise.
Yeah, and I think there's some interesting points in there because this part of it's probably just how those numbers get calculated, but yeah, it's also, I guess, it's I think there's a perception that if you do something online, it's kind of impact free, right? The internet's like, oh, there's no impact of the internet, but yet there's a huge impact associated with data centers and networking and all that kind of stuff in the background. Michael raised a question. Why was that what you thought? Like, why did you think that it would be so much lower?
It was probably, us understanding the impact of purchased goods and services and the contribution that makes to carbon. I think, everyone can easily equate to travel and movement and running an office with electricity. Those things make a lot of sense. And the variance across the purchased goods and services and the more data that you have around those. So what is the type of, vehicle that you're using and the mode of transport, the type of catering that you're providing, and all of those things provide a richer source in terms of understanding the carbon. So I think it was the context of understanding how significant purchased goods and services are in the carbon profile.
Cool. We've got a related question from Tim on that, who asks, what proportion of products and service providers can provide useful information on their emissions?
I think that's a growing request that we've put out to the people that we're working with. So as a result of this work, we're talking to all of our suppliers about what other information can be provided to support us so that we do move from that dollar spend potentially to the hope that you move to an activity-based understanding of the service or the activity that you're looking at. So
yeah. And
more work to be done.
From my perspective, Tim, it's very low. There's not many companies that can actually provide that kind of information at the moment. We have another question from Kanaka, which is, have you found that there is more support from government for transforming and retrofitting buildings now that you've found that 20% of the carbon is from buildings? So is there more support for that now that that it's sort of more visible, the carbon footprint of buildings?
It'd be fair to say that the tools at the moment are focused on new buildings. So a lot of the energy and effort is around the new buildings and what that means for new outcomes. So we've just recently seen changes to energy efficiency regulated standards, which is about new buildings, and the Building for Climate Change work will focus on new builds. However, I think if we can get those things progressing, there will be a lot more effort focused on alterations and additions.
No, that's really great. All right, well, we're on time, and that was the last question that we had. So I'd like to close now and just thank you so much, Teena, for coming and sharing your thoughts with us. Really interesting to see the work that you've been doing. Really great for you to share your perspective. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming and listening today, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.